Welcome everybody. It's fantastic to see such a huge crowd. Our first annual Pinecone Summit. We couldn't be more excited to have you all here. It's really incredible the kind of response that we had. Amanda mentioned that our first meetup here in San Francisco was a few weeks ago, and we had a few hundred people. And this one's pretty much sold out. So thank you so much for joining our first Pinecone Summit. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of who's here, we have more than 800 registrants and expect more people to walk in through the day. Many of you may have walked in today. A lot of people are here from the San Francisco area, but 7 people from 17 countries have flown in for the Pinecone Summit. And so we thank you for coming the longest distance and joining us today. And lots of people from out of state as well. So 27 states represented here. So we're building a big community. We're thrilled that the community is worldwide. So thanks again. Okay, so I'm going to spend just a few minutes and give a few perspectives on the generative AI market, on the vector database market. We have an interesting view of what's happening. We have lots of customers, which I'll talk about in a minute, that give us a really interesting view of what's happening in the market. So I'll talk a little bit about some of our key observations and at a very high level, what we think are some of the keys to success. So let's go ahead and get started. Obviously, the generative AI market is just exploding. We certainly believe, as many people believe, that this is the next major platform. The previous platform is the internet platform, and that the generative AI platform is going to be even bigger than the internet. And that might be hard to believe for some people, since the internet has had such a huge impact, not only in high tech, but in the world as a whole. But I think that generative AI really does have the potential to have that kind of an impact, and certainly from a technology perspective in terms of just delivering better and better tools and technology for people. But just like the internet had big social and geopolitical impacts, likewise, I think the generative AI platform is going to have the same and probably even bigger impacts on the world. So it's a very exciting place to be. I'm sure you're all excited to be a part of this incredible opportunity. Now, it's interesting to us that the people that are getting involved in generative AI really run the full gamut. It's individuals, it's new startups, it's small companies, and certainly it's also big enterprises, all of whom are already making significant investments in generative AI. Certainly from a startup perspective, over the past year and a half, the funding environment has been quite difficult in general, but obviously that is not the case for generative AI companies. And so this chart here just is from PitchBook, and it shows what the deal value is collectively of venture capital-based deals, and then how many deals are getting done. And the key thing is on the lower right is that from Q4 to Q1, there was almost a tripling of the amount of investment, and most of that tripling is associated with generative AI, and then we're expecting even a bigger jump in the second quarter. Those numbers aren't available yet, but everyone expects a very significant increase. So I think many of you out there are from startups, are trying to build new companies, new applications, and I think it's an incredibly exciting world, and we're certainly seeing that in terms of the number of individuals and startup companies that are experimenting with Pinecone as a part of their generative AI solutions. But it's certainly not just the startups. One of the things that's been, pretty amazing to see in such a short period of time is that large companies, the enterprises, are really investing very quickly in building generative AI applications. And one of the phenomena that's happening, probably not that surprising, given the impact of generative AI, is that boardrooms are having discussions about generative AI. They're asking the CEOs and the management teams what they're doing in the generative AI space. They want regular updates. And so, whereas enterprises often are relatively slow to adopt new technologies, that's not the case here. They're making big investments, and they're making those investments very early. We certainly see that as well. We see lots of developers and enterprises coming on to our free tier, moving on to our paid tier, doing both experimentation and then taking lots of applications to production. Things are happening very, very fast. Now, this slide talks a little bit about hype. The chart here is what some people refer to as the hype cycle. And it basically shows there's some innovative trigger that starts, then there's a huge increase in expectations, and people start pontificating about all the incredible things that you can do with a new technology, and they kind of lose sight of reality and time. And I think we're probably relatively close to the top of that peak. And you're starting to see some indicators that we're coming down from that peak. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing, right? We need to, get through all of that hype and then get down to the real business of building great applications and building great companies. And I think we're starting to see that happen. A lot of the fluff, a lot of the interesting prototypes that really have no ability to go into production, they're just interesting. Those are kind of, washing away somewhat. And all of you are starting to figure out what's real, what kinds of apps can you really build that have real impact on the world, that allows you to build really interesting businesses, disrupt existing businesses, et cetera. So I think probably between now and then, I don't call it, at least in this area, the trough of disillusionment, but it's the trough of reality, right? We're going to actually start focusing on the things that really have a chance to work. And then I think from there, it's going to continue to be a super, super exciting place to be. So what role do vector databases play in all of this? We don't provide the complete generative AI solution, so what role do we play? Well, vector databases, and as I think many of you know, because you've already used vector databases, but some of you might be a little bit fuzzier as to the role they play, they solve a really important problem, or at least help solve a really important problem, which is that the hallucinations of the chat GPTs and the other chatbots that are available. There are two big problems, of course, with those chatbots and the underlying models. In the case of ChatGPT, GPT-4. And those two big problems are, number one, that it's trained largely on information scraped from the internet. And so it doesn't have access to all kinds of knowledge, all kinds of domain-specific information that is locked in corporate data stores and is highly proprietary. So just like if we're not, as individuals, expert in some domain, like maybe some medical domain, because we don't have expertise in that area, ChatGPT and other similar chatbots that are trained on information scraped from the internet don't have access or knowledge about any of that information. The second key problem, of course, is that it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to train these foundational models, and they can't be trained in real time. So ChatGPT or GPT-4, for example, is about 18 months out of date. It was finished being trained, I think it's roughly 18 months ago. And so any recent information is not information that ChatGPT is going to know about. So those are two big problems that cause a lot of hallucinations. And vector databases, whether it's Pinecone or some other vector database, are a key part of the solution to those problems. And of course, it provides a solution because what you can do is, of course, if you ask a question of ChatGPT, before you submit that question to ChatGPT, you can use semantic search. You can convert that question into some vector that allows you to do a vector search, that allows you of a domain-specific database, allows you to return some information that you can put into the context window of the prompt that you give ChatGPT. So basically, you can think of vector databases and semantic search as a context engine. You can think of it as the thing that can provide to you domain-specific context that you can submit as a part of the context window of a prompt to ChatGPT or similar chatbots. And in that way, you will have far fewer hallucinations. You will allow these fantastic, chatbot technologies to answer your questions correctly more often. So that's the basic role that vector databases play in generative AI, and where Pinecone is thrilled to be a part of so many of those projects. Now, we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have a great perspective on kind of what's happening, and that's as a result of the number of users who have built enough confidence in Pinecone to work with Pinecone as their vector database. So amazingly, just at the end of last year, we had low thousands of free tier users, and we had almost 300 paying tier users. Okay? And we were thrilled with the progress that we made. We only had our product on the market basically since the very beginning of 2022, and we were thrilled with the progress that we were making. But in the last 6 months, it's got absolutely crazy. Right? ChatGPT came on to the market and took the world by storm in, I think it was end of November, and it really picked up speed in December. And now 6 months later, we have way over 100,000 free tier users. We have more than 4,000 paying customers. It's grown incredibly fast. And as I'll talk about in a minute, a big part of that is the huge amount of experimentation that's taking place in this space. What are some of the key observations that we've seen, particularly over the last 6 months? The first is that this is very much a developer-led market. Developers, as is often the case, and has been the case for the past 20 years, developers are picking up new technologies. They're especially initially free technologies that are easy to use, that allows them to first learn about the new technology, then start to experiment with it, then start to think about projects that they might want to build from an individual perspective or in their companies, and then start to build more and more confidence in what not only a vector database but the other surrounding technologies can do, so they can figure out what kinds of products to build. So we see this as being very much a developer-led revolution, and certainly from a Pinecone perspective, we're very, very focused on providing the best possible developer experience so that you can go through this learning and experimentation process as quickly and easily and with as much joy as possible. The second thing is something I've already talked about, is just the incredible amount of experimentation. It's certainly experimentation, just playing around with stuff, but it's also experimentation once people go into production. Even when they're in production, they're continuing to experiment. Obviously, the technology is moving very, very fast. Our technology is moving fast. Many of the other related technologies are moving very, very fast. And so people are continuing to do a tremendous amount of experimentation with their applications, even when they're in production. The final point is that we're more convinced than ever that vector databases are going to be a key part of building generative AI applications. There's a lot of discussion about how much can you put in the foundation models, how much additional benefit can you get by fine-tuning your models versus putting your domain-specific information in your vector database. And certainly what we've seen, and based on the trends that we see for how technology is going to evolve in the future, we think vector databases are going to be a very big part of these generative AI solutions. So just kind of to summarize, we think, the key thing is let developers experiment, do production scale experiments, meaning continue to experiment even when you're in production to make the apps better and better, take advantage of the rapidly moving technology. And then not all of you, of course, are in enterprises, but if you happen to be in an enterprise, obviously enterprise readiness is really, really important. And so, looking at different technologies that can really provide you with the security, with the governance capability, et cetera, that you need, of course, is going to be very, very important. as enterprises move very quickly to adopt technology and build generative AI applications. So let the learning begin. Again, thank you all for being here today. We're working hard to build a community. We've got, 20 people here from Pinecone. Seek them out. They have a lot of expertise in working with other companies, and we're coming up the learning curve quickly ourselves. Seek them out to help you to build your applications, but also seek out other people in the community. There's a lot of people here who have a lot of experience in general building Gen AI applications, and more specifically with Pinecone. We strongly encourage you to seek them out, and let's build a super strong community of users where we can collectively build some fantastic applications. Great, I think that's it. I think, Dominic, you're gonna host some of the questions.
Testing, great. Yeah, so just a reminder, we put the code back up. I know it was there for kind of a short window. So if you have a question for Bob, and anyone moving forward, it's gonna be the same platform. Please join us there and submit your questions, and then I'm gonna be pulling the questions from there live, so please submit them when you can. To start out, Bob, the first question is, large language models have been used in many ways that probably weren't originally intended for. Do you anticipate the models continuing to serve as a focal point for AI in the future?
I'm sorry, continue to see the LLMs
as a focal point for AI.
Yeah. So for sure, LLMs are going to be an absolutely critical part of generative AI applications. And so I think the big thing with foundation models is that certainly today it takes a tremendous amount of expertise to be able to train a model. It takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. And so I think there are a lot of companies, particularly enterprises, that are, I would say, at least experimenting with training their own, foundational models. But I think there's not going to be a huge number of companies that certainly in the near term are going to go through the cost and pain and effort of building or training their own foundation models. I think there'll be a larger number of companies that decide to spend time, effort, and money on fine-tuning models, but that still requires a lot of expertise. It's not as expensive, but it's still very expensive. And so again, there's a limited number of companies that are going to be able to take that on. Certainly the bigger companies and enterprises will. And then that, of course, leaves vector databases. And vector databases, I think, are a key part of the mix. And certainly we see many companies that put their domain-specific information into a vector database and use that as opposed to fine-tuning, or sometimes in conjunction with fine-tuning. So this is a key thing. Everyone's trying to figure out, what's the magical mix, right? And the magical mix is not just a technology question of what can you do. It's also, for example, a cost question or a timing question, right? I mean, even if I build a foundational model, I can't train that in real time. So even if I think I get a lot of benefit from it, I'm still going to need a vector database for all the real-time information, for example, right? So I think there's tons of experimentation going on. Foundation models, fine-tuning, and vector databases will all be a part of the mix. And a year from now, we'll know a lot more about the best practices in terms of exactly what that mix is.
Thanks. Another question is, you mentioned that there was that peak of inflated expectations or excitement in the market, but you feel like it's tailoring off. What are the signs that you're seeing that make you think that it's tailoring off and we're starting to approach a more stable environment?
Yeah, and so there's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, you probably, some of you may have read in the news, right, that ChatGPT, for example, is experiencing a decline, right? And for example, I think the pontificators about trying to figure out why is saying, there's a lot of people that tried it because it was really interesting, because everyone was talking about it, and now they're not using it as much. There's another theory that because kids got out of school and there was a ton of usage among kids, that is at least a meaningful part of the decline. But I think that's not at all unexpected. It couldn't continue the way that it was going. And our own personal experiences at Pinecone was that in April, it was unbelievable, the incredible number of free tier users that came onto our platform. I mean, it just went like crazy, right? And then in May and in June, it settled back down to something more reasonable, right? So those are the direct indicators for us. There's some external indicators, and I think that's really good for the market. The quicker we can get through the hype and we can get to building real applications that really have an impact on the world, the better off the industry is going to be.
What do you think about the role of vector databases and retrieval augmented generators, generative AI, going forward as these context windows expand? For example, there's environments with 1 billion vector embeddings. How are they going to work together?
Yeah, I guess I have two perspectives on that. The first perspective is, because I get asked this all the time, right, is that, well, context windows are going to get bigger. Why don't I just put my whole database into the context window, right? And I mean, in most things in life, like even think of yourself. I mean, if we get swamped with information, we don't get better answers, right? It's when we get information that's the most useful, that it's, and it's manageably small, that we're able to absorb that, internalize it, and provide the best answers, using our judgment based on that. And I think the same kind of thing is true in terms of the context window and putting huge amounts of information into it. And so that's our belief. And now there's actually evidence, okay? So I think it's a Stanford study that came out, I think it was earlier this week, but it's very recent, that basically looked at existing chatbot technology and looked at, if you provided it a lot of information in the context versus a little bit of information, what produced the better results. And I'm not going to go through the whole study, but basically what it said was giving less context, number one, was better. And I believe the other key conclusion was that it was interesting that the context that was at the beginning and the context that was at the end ended up affecting the response most, and the context in the middle affected it least. Okay, so anyway, if you're interested in that, learning about that, I would point you to that Stanford study. I think it was Stanford, and I'm sure there'll be more studies like this, all a part of building best practices and understanding what's the best approach to using these incredible technologies.
Okay, last question for Bob here. What distinguishes Pinecone from its competitors, and what do you view as your keys to customer success?
Let me answer that at a very high level. I'll give a little bit of historic context first, right, in the database industry. Whenever there's a new data type and new access patterns of that data, and assuming the market is large enough, a new subset of the database market forms. Right? That happened with relational databases. I previously ran Couchbase, a NoSQL database company. That happened in NoSQL as well. In NoSQL, which is more recent, right? You have the JSON documents. You have a document model. That's a very different way to represent data, and that provided a much easier, better way for developers to work with data. You had very, very different access patterns. NoSQL sits under the web and mobile applications that are the underpinnings for digital economy businesses, and you had huge and increasing numbers of users using more and more data-driven features that drove a huge increase in the number of database operations. So that's what I mean in that case with the access patterns being very, very different. And the same thing we believe is true with vector databases. Obviously, vectors are a very different way to represent data. And then if you look at how that data is being accessed, right, it's nearest neighbor search, right? It's very different kinds of indexes that you're building, right? So we think this is a new database category, and we think that if you're going to build the best generative AI applications, you're going to build them based on the best of breed technologies. Whatever you think that is, whether that's Pinecone or someone else, we encourage you to build it on the best of breed, right? Because the lower latency, the higher ingestion speeds, the lower cost of implementing your use case, those kinds of differentiators between one vector database and another is going to make a huge impact on your applications and the success of your applications. So we believe it's a separate database category, that for the vendors, if you don't build a no compromises from scratch solution, you're not going to have the leading technology, right? So that to me is number one. There's supposedly over 30 vector databases out there already, okay? So it must be getting very confusing for people. But most of those are what we call bolt-on solutions. They're not build from scratch solutions. They're trying to, include vectors in some existing technology. We don't think those technologies will ultimately be among the leaders. It's the ones that built their technology from scratch. The second thing is we think so much of the market has moved to the cloud that the winners are going to be ones that have built the best managed services. And again, we think you need to build that from scratch, right? Trying to port some open source technology on to the cloud usually doesn't work out very well. So those are two dimensions, without getting into all the detail. And then look, at the end of the day, we think if you have a from scratch solution and you have a from scratch managed service, let's duke it out, right? Let's duke it out, right? Who has the lowest latency? Who has the best queries per second? Who has the best, ingestion speeds, et cetera? And I think at the moment we feel, really good that we're, if not the leader, then certainly one of the leaders from a technology perspective. And our commitment to everyone is that we're going to continue to focus on building the very best technology with no compromises.
Thanks again, Bob, for your presentation and the question.
Thank you all. Have a great day.